Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the cold stone corridors of a medieval palace, where the air smells faintly of beeswax, wet wool, and the faintest trace of incense from the chapel. Outside, the rain hasn't stopped for 3 days, turning the castle yard into a churn of mud and hoofprints. In here, torches flicker against carved walls, their light dancing over tapestries of past victories. Somewhere deep in this maze of rooms, behind an oak door reinforced with iron studs, a queen sits stiff-backed on a carved chair, wearing a crown that feels more like a yoke than a prize. She is married to the most powerful man in the realm. But this marriage, it's about as romantic as a tax ledger. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not the draft creeping under every door, not the food that's been salted into near mummification, and definitely not the political minefield that passes for royal domestic life. Kings and queens in the Middle Ages didn't often marry for love. They married for land, treaties, or the promise that their families would stop sending armies to kill each other. And when the ink dried on those treaties, the king's heart, or at least his attention, often wandered. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 a.m? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now dim the lights. Let your shoulders relax. And let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together, here on Timeless Sleep. You walk alongside the king's marriage procession in your mind's eye. Not a joyful parade of flowers and music, but a deliberate political display. The bride, perhaps just 14 or 15, is a daughter of a foreign duke or a distant cousin from another royal house. Her dowry isn't a trunk of jewels, it's a stretch of disputed borderland, or the rights to levy tolls along a key trade route. The king, often a decade or two older, might have met her once before the wedding, or never at all. You can almost hear the clatter of hooves on the cobblestones, the murmured Latin prayers, as the couple kneels at the altar. Every eye in the court studies them, not for signs of love, but for signs that this alliance will hold. The marriage is a chess move, in a game that stretches across generations. In medieval Europe, your spouse was your treaty, your shield, and occasionally your hostage, but not necessarily your friend, and rarely your lover. And here's the thing, political marriages demanded heirs. Not an heir, plural. The ideal was one healthy crown prince to inherit, and at least one spare in case plague, accident, or battlefield mishap, claimed the first. This pressure wasn't just on the queen, it was on the dynasty. The whole stability of the realm could hinge on producing male heirs, which is why fertility and the perception of fertility mattered so much. Now, imagine you're the king, and your marriage to the queen is cordial, but formal. Maybe she's shy, maybe she's from a culture with different customs, maybe the two of you barely speak the same language. In some cases, the queen's health might make pregnancies difficult, or perhaps, and this happened often enough, the marriage was simply not passionate. That's where the figure of the concubine enters, not as a shadowy scandal in the back corridors, but as an acknowledged, even semi-official part of royal life. Royal concubines were not random tavern girls or passing flings. In many courts, they were chosen carefully, often noble women themselves, or ladies in waiting, whose beauty, wit, or political connections caught the king's attention. This wasn't a medieval equivalent of dating for fun. It was an extension of power politics into the bedchamber. The queen understood the deal. In fact, in some courts, concubines were given their own apartments in the palace, their own servants, and sometimes even ceremonial roles. Publicly, the queen might maintain dignity by ignoring the arrangement. Privately, she might see the scheme, or in rare but clever cases, form alliances with these women to maintain influence over the king. Think of medieval marriage as a grand stage performance. The king and queen played the leading roles in public, attending feasts, presiding over ceremonies, producing heirs. Behind the curtain, however, the king might have a supporting cast of lovers, each with her own part to play. One mainstream historical fact here. In the Capetian dynasty of France, kings like Charles VII maintained mistresses, who wielded significant political sway, Agnes Sorel being a prime example. She was openly acknowledged at court, given jewels, and even appeared alongside the Queen at events. The existence of such women was not considered a catastrophic scandal, it was woven into the fabric of court life. And here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval chroniclers sometimes kept careful records of concubines, not just in terms of names, but physical descriptions, hair colour, height, even supposed signs of good fortune on their bodies. In some places, freckles and certain patterns were considered lucky, as though fate itself had marked them for royal company. As you walk through this imagined palace, you pass the Queen's chambers, rich with embroidered hangings, depicting saints and biblical scenes, the air scented with lavender and beeswax. Further along, a smaller but no less elegant set of rooms houses the king's favourite concubine. Her walls might be hung with hunting scenes or courtly romances, gifts from the king meant to flatter her and signal her special status. The servants know which rooms to enter quietly and which to knock upon. The gossip flows in hushed whispers around the hearth. Political marriages also meant that personal attraction could easily fall outside the royal couple. Kings often encountered potential concubines among the wives and daughters of noblemen who visited court, among foreign hostages, or even during their own military campaigns. When those women became part of the royal household, they sometimes arrived as ladies-in-waiting, attendants to the Queen, only to find themselves promoted to an entirely different role. The term concubine itself had a different weight then. In modern ears, it might sound like an insult or a scandal, but in medieval contexts, especially in courts influenced by older Roman or Eastern traditions, a concubine could be recognized as an official secondary partner, her children sometimes legitimized through royal decree. In certain cases, the king's relationship with a concubine lasted far longer and burned far hotter than his formal marriage. From a purely political perspective, a concubine could also be a safety valve. Royal marriages often bound two powerful families together, but also risked inflaming old rivalries if one side felt slighted. By taking lovers from multiple noble houses, a king could spread out favours and potential grudges more widely. It was a dangerous balancing act, but it could keep the court's factions from uniting against him. You might expect queens to rage against this system, and some certainly did. There are records of royal wives refusing to share public appearances with their husband's mistress, or manoeuvring to have them married off to some distant baron. But others took a longer view. So long as the concubine didn't undermine the queen's official position or her children's inheritance, the arrangement could be tolerated as part of the political machinery. Picture the wedding feast again, the one that marked the queen's arrival. The hall is blazing with torchlight. The tables sag under roasted meats and candied fruits, the air full of laughter and lute music. Somewhere among the dancers is a young noblewoman with hair like spun gold or eyes that catch the light like emerald glass. The king notices her. The queen notices that he notices her, and just like that, the first threads of a new arrangement begin to weave themselves into the fabric of the court. Of course, not every king was discreet. Some flaunted their favourites shamelessly, seating them at the high table, or showering them with gifts so lavish they made the queen's jewels look modest. Such displays could be risky. Nobles loyal to the queen might resent the influence of a mere concubine, while foreign envoys might interpret it as a sign of discord in the royal marriage. But in an age when power often came down to proximity, who could get the king's ear at the right moment, concubines often sat closer than anyone else. In your slow wander through these corridors, you start to sense how little the royal marriage was about personal companionship. The queen's chief role was to anchor the dynasty in public legitimacy. The concubine's role was to meet other needs, personal, political, and sometimes even strategic. Together, they formed a strange and often uneasy triangle that defined life in the medieval palace. And somewhere behind the walls and the rituals and the layers of brocade, there were real people. Lonely, ambitious, affectionate, jealous, navigating a system that turned intimacy into a form of statecraft. Walk into a throne room on an ordinary day, not a feast day or a wedding, and you might notice the queen seated in her formal robes, a living symbol of the dynasty's legitimacy. Not far from her, at the edge of the dais or perhaps just beyond the ranks of courtiers, you might spot another woman, younger or older, finely dressed but not wearing a crown. She greets visiting nobles with a smile, exchanges a word with the king when protocol allows, and drifts gracefully through the assembly like a living reminder that royal favour is a currency of its own. You linger in the palace halls a little longer, letting your thoughts wander into the quieter, more dimly lit corners, where court culture takes on its stranger shapes. In the medieval imagination, a concubine was not always just a shadow in the background. In many courts, she was a polished, public figure, woven into the spectacle of power. She wasn't hidden away in shame, nor merely tolerated as a private indulgence. She was part of the furniture of authority itself, a role with its own social protocols and expectations. In many medieval courts, particularly those in France, England, and certain German principalities, the presence of a king's concubine could even add to the glamour of the monarchy. After all, to be a king was to live outside the ordinary moral limits that applied to lesser men. If you could defy death in battle, dictate the laws of the land, and claim the right to command thousands, surely you could keep the company you pleased. For some onlookers, the concubine was not a moral scandal, but a sign of virility, potency, and control, qualities many rulers cultivated in their public image. You can almost hear the way courtiers whispered in the shadow of columns, "Who had the king's ear this week?" Which lady's apartments he visited after supper, which family might be rising in influence because of their daughter's charm. Gossip was the bloodstream of the court, and a concubine was like a sudden surge in its pressure, affecting marriages, careers, and alliances far beyond the royal bedchamber. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some concubines, in medieval courts, had official badges or liveries, small emblems sewn into their gowns or displayed on jewellery, marking them as under royal protection. It was like having a VIP pass to every corridor, banquet, and hunt in the realm. One mainstream historical fact here: in 15th century Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good openly kept multiple mistresses and integrated them into his courtly festivities. Far from being tucked away, these women were sometimes honoured guests at tournaments and banquets, their gowns as fine as any princesses. Chroniclers recorded them by name, and noble families sometimes saw their daughters' roles as mistresses to the duke as an opportunity rather than a disgrace. You move from the throne room into the great hall, where the business of the court unfolds each day. Petitioners wait to present their cases, scribes record proclamations, messengers dash in with news from the borders. The king's concubine, if she is favoured enough, might slip in among these formalities to murmur a word to the monarch, or pass along a note. That tiny moment of access could tilt the outcome of a lawsuit, a military appointment, or a trade concession. Her role is more than personal. It is political theatre, every gesture signalling to the watching eyes in the hall. In some courts, especially those with a more rigid ceremonial tradition like the Byzantine Empire, concubines were absorbed into an elaborate hierarchy of women in service to the monarch. They might be titled favourites or beloveds, ranked according to the king's favour, and assigned rooms and retinues appropriate to their status. Their duties could include accompanying the king to festivals, representing the court at minor diplomatic receptions, or even acting as patrons for artists, musicians, and poets. And the court is always watching. The queen, though she may not openly acknowledge her rival, must account for the concubine's influence. In the endless balancing act of power, the queen's authority rests on law, ceremony, and the dynasty's official narrative. The concubine's power is more fluid, built on charm, proximity, and the ability to deliver the king's mood, and perhaps his promises to others. There was a peculiar etiquette to it all. A concubine, who flaunted herself too openly, risked stirring resentment among the nobility or embarrassing the queen in ways that could backfire. Too much discretion, on the other hand, could see her influence fade. Navigating that line required instinct, intelligence, and the kind of charisma that could make even rivals admire her in spite of themselves. The interplay between queen and concubine was often invisible in official records, but it's not hard to imagine the subtle competitions. A lavish gown, ordered for the queen's appearance at Easter, might be answered by an equally sumptuous gown for the concubine at Pentecost. A feast in the queen's honour might be matched by a hunt where the concubine rides at the king's side, her falcon on her glove. In these silent duels, victories weren't announced, They were seen, felt, and remembered. Your footsteps echo as you wander toward the gardens, imagining how these women lived when the public eye turned away. A concubine might spend her mornings meeting with her personal servants, reviewing her wardrobe, or sending small tokens, ribbons, scented gloves, a finely worked kerchief to those she wanted to win over at court. The afternoons might bring music, reading, embroidery, or the social game of visiting other ladies' apartments to exchange news. In the evenings, the concubine's presence at dinner could be carefully timed, arriving late to make an entrance, lingering after the queen departed to speak privately with the king. You pause by a fountain in the imagined palace gardens. The water is cold, the stone rim damp from a morning rain. In your mind, you picture a concubine here, cloaked in deep green velvet, listening to the confidences of a young knight or the complaints of a lady-in-waiting whose brother seeks a position. She might pass along these tidbits to the king in the privacy of his chambers, nudging him towards certain decisions, and those nudges, repeated over months and years, could shift the course of a kingdom. Concubines could also be cultural patrons. The courts of medieval Spain, influenced by both Christian and Islamic traditions, sometimes saw concubines sponsoring poets or musicians, creating small cultural circles within the larger palace. In doing so, they extended their influence beyond politics into the shaping of taste, fashion, and the arts, subtle legacies that could outlast their own tenure in the royal household. One can't overlook the ceremonial visibility of concubines during processions, feasts, and religious festivals. While the queen might ride in a gilded carriage or walk beneath a canopy, the concubine might be positioned nearby, visible enough to be recognized, distant enough to acknowledge the queen's precedence. Such appearances were not casual. They signaled to the court who held the king's favor at that moment, a living indicator of shifting tides in the palace's inner sea. There's a certain irony in how concubines were often more visible in public life than the private wives of lesser nobles. A baron's lady might spend her days in near seclusion on a rural estate, while a king's concubine could ride through the capital in a train of carriages, drawing curious crowds. This visibility meant that common people too formed opinions about these women, admiring, resenting, or gossiping about them just as much as the courtiers did. And yet, for all the splendor, the role carried risk. Fall out of favor, and a concubine could be quietly married off to a lesser noble, sent to a country estate, or even persuaded into a convent. Lose the king's interest too soon, and the apartments, the gifts, and the influence vanished like mist. But for those who navigated the court's currents skillfully, the position could endure for years, sometimes longer than the king's marriage itself. Back inside, the corridors hum with activity, heralds carrying scrolls, servants rushing to prepare for the next banquet, scribes bent over their desks. Somewhere in these rooms, the king's concubine writes a letter to her family, describing her life in careful, guarded terms. She might mention the fine gown she wore last week, the conversation she had with a visiting ambassador, or the hawk the king gave her after the autumn hunt. Every line is part truth, part performance, a message to her kin that she is thriving, a reassurance that their family's fortunes are rising through her presence at court. And in the end, the medieval court didn't pretend otherwise. The king's public life was his kingdom's business, and his private life was too, especially when the two overlapped so thoroughly that they became impossible to tell apart. You end your slow walk back in the great hall, noticing how the queen sits still in her carved chair, a figure of dignity, while the concubine drifts through the room like a warm current in cold water. Both women are part of the same performance, a show of wealth, stability, and magnificence, even as their personal realities might be worlds apart. The court accepts this duality as normal, because in the medieval mind, the king's body and household were extensions of the kingdom itself. If a concubine strengthened his happiness, confidence, or alliances, she was as much a political asset as any treaty or fortress. You step deeper into this imagined palace, your thoughts turning to the most pragmatic reason kings kept concubines beside their queens: the business of heirs. In a world without modern medicine, where childbirth was dangerous and childhood survival was never guaranteed, the urgency to produce not just an heir, but a line of spares weighed heavily on every royal household. A single accident, a single outbreak of fever, could throw an entire dynasty into crisis. The queen was expected to bear children quickly and frequently, and each pregnancy was both a personal ordeal and a matter of state security. But nature didn't always cooperate. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths were painfully common, and if the queen failed to produce surviving male heirs, pressure began to mount from every direction: the court, the nobility, even the church. In that climate, concubines became more than personal indulgences. They were a form of insurance. You can picture it. The royal council gathered in a cold chamber, the king seated at the head of a long oak table. His advisors murmur about alliances, trade, and the looming threat of war. But underneath it all lies the unspoken question: what if the queen cannot give us another son? The dynasty must be secured. A mistress who bore the king's child could, in certain cases, be elevated in status, and her offspring, though technically illegitimate, might still be groomed for power if the situation demanded it. One mainstream historical fact here: King Henry I of England fathered over 20 illegitimate children, many through recognised mistresses. While only his legitimate son was officially the heir, Henry used his other children to cement alliances, marrying his daughters to powerful nobles across Europe. The concubines who bore those children were part of a broader dynastic strategy, even if their names rarely appeared in official chronicles. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some medieval courts, there was a belief, half superstition, half folk wisdom, that a man's virility and luck in fathering strong sons could be proven by having children with multiple women. Kings who boasted of numerous offspring, legitimate or not, were thought to be favoured by God, fate, or both. In the palace, this meant that a concubine's pregnancy could be greeted with a surprising degree of ceremony. Servants might bring her special foods, musicians might be hired to lift her spirits, and the king might visit her chambers openly. When the child was born, the news could ripple through the court with nearly as much excitement and anxiety as a birth in the queen's apartments. The reaction often depended on the child's sex. A son might prompt whispers of succession trouble, while a daughter could be seen as a valuable marriage pawn for future alliances. You wander in your mind to the nursery wing of the palace, a warm, firelit space with carved cradles, embroidered swaddling cloths, and the scent of milk and herbs in the air. Here, legitimate and illegitimate royal children might be raised together in their earliest years, cared for by wet nurses and governesses, before their paths diverged. The queen's children would eventually be surrounded by tutors, clerics, and the trappings of courtly training. The concubine's children might be sent to foster with loyal nobles or raised quietly in the palace, until a suitable match or role was found for them. This arrangement wasn't simply about affection or personal preference. It was a safeguard against dynastic collapse. In times of war, rebellion, or plague, having multiple sons, even illegitimate ones, meant there was always someone to rally the crown's supporters. Sometimes, in the chaos of succession disputes, a concubine's child would become the last viable claimant. History holds more than one example where the spare born to a royal mistress ended up wearing the crown. The arrangement also served another purpose. It spread the royal bloodline wider, embedding it into noble families across the realm. By recognizing and providing for their illegitimate children, kings ensured loyalty from the families into which those children married. A noble who could call himself the brother-in-law or cousin of a king, even through a concubine's line, might think twice before joining a rebellion. In your quiet mental stroll, you pass through the king's private study, where maps, scrolls, and genealogies clutter the walls. Here is where the dynastic game is planned, marriages plotted years in advance, potential alliances mapped out like a tapestry. The concubine's children are threads in that tapestry, some brightly visible, others hidden in the weave, but all part of the pattern. From the queen's perspective, this dynamic could be maddening. Each child born to a concubine was a reminder of her own precarious position. While her legitimacy as queen could not be challenged without extraordinary cause, her influence could be undermined if the king began to favour another woman's offspring. Some queens fought fiercely to have concubines dismissed or their children sent far away. Others chose a subtler approach, welcoming those children into the royal fold and ensuring they were raised in ways that reinforced loyalty to the queen's own sons. One such example is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who tolerated some of Henry II's illegitimate children in her household, using their presence to keep an eye on potential rivals and to signal her magnanimity. By embracing them publicly, she maintained control over how they fit into the larger family narrative. But it wasn't only the queen who had to think strategically. The concubines themselves understood the stakes. Bearing a royal child could secure their position for years, ensuring continued gifts, apartments and influence. Fail to produce a child, and their tenure at court might be cut short. For some, this pressure was immense. Their value to the king and to the court, often measured in the swaddled bundles they handed to the royal nurses. You imagine the moment. A concubine, pale and tired, cradling a newborn as the king enters her chamber. His expression, relief, pride, calculation, says as much as any formal proclamation. Servants bow low, the wet nurse hovers in the background, and the court waits to hear the official announcement. If it's a boy, the church bells may toll in celebration, even if the child will never be crowned. If it's a girl, plans for her future begin almost immediately. The need for multiple heirs and spares also explains why some kings kept more than one concubine at a time. It wasn't necessarily about personal excess, though that played a part, but about hedging bets in an era when infant mortality could wipe out years of careful planning. By maintaining relationships with several women, a king increased the odds of securing the number of healthy children he needed for political stability. In some cases, the royal mistress could even overshadow the queen in maternal influence. If a concubine's son was favoured by the king, she might become his advocate, shaping his education, overseeing his appointments, and steering him toward positions of power. Even without the crown, such a son could hold vast sway as a duke, earl or commander. All of this played out in the subtle theatre of the court. At a feast, a favoured concubine might be seated near the king, with her child given a place of honour among the young nobles. At a hunt, the king might publicly praise the boy's skill with a bow or his quick wits. These gestures sent ripples through the noble ranks, signalling who might one day stand at the heart of the kingdom's power structure. You drift back toward the imagined Great Hall, where the king and queen appear together for a formal ceremony. Behind them, in the ranks of well-born youths, stands a boy with his mother's eyes and the king's jawline. Whispers pass from one courtier to another. That's the son of his mistress, isn't it? They note his fine clothes, his confident bearing, and the way the king's gaze lingers on him. Such moments could shape the politics of the realm, as surely as any treaty signed in ink. Ultimately, the keeping of concubines in the name of producing heirs was not merely tolerated in many medieval courts. It was woven into the logic of rulership. The stakes were too high, the risks of a childless succession too great. In a time when the health of one child could determine the fate of entire kingdoms, the king's private relationships became matters of public survival. And so, in the cold and candlelit corridors of these palaces, the presence of concubines was never just about romance or even desire. It was about securing the line, fortifying the dynasty, and ensuring that, whatever misfortune came, plague, battle, betrayal, the kingdom would not be left leaderless. You wander further into the palace's imagined heart, past the bustle of servants and the gleam of candlelit corridors, until you arrive in the queen's private chambers, the ceremonial centre of her life. Yet, paradoxically, the place where her political reach is most constrained. Queens in the medieval world often lived at the crossroads of immense symbolic power and startlingly limited practical authority. She was the embodiment of the dynasty's legitimacy, the mother of heirs, the hostess of courtly ritual, but rarely was she the king's chief advisor, and even more rarely his sole confidant. Her role was scripted long before she entered the palace. From the moment a royal marriage was arranged, the queen-to-be was groomed for a set of duties that revolved around maintaining the crown's image and fulfilling dynastic needs. She would preside over ceremonies, receive foreign envoys, and serve as the visible counterpart to the king during public appearances. But decisions about war law or the kingdom's treasury were almost always taken elsewhere, in rooms where queens were not invited to sit at the table. You can picture her now, seated beneath a canopy in a hall perfumed with beeswax and rosewater, her gown a sweep of embroidered silk. She receives ambassadors, nods graciously as petitions are read aloud, and offers polite but non-committal replies. Her words may be repeated later in chronicles, but the decisions those ambassadors care about, the treaties, the trade routes, the military commitments, are shaped in private councils of men, often without her input. This formal distance left space for others to step into the king's inner circle, and concubines often filled that gap. Where the queen's position was ceremonial, a concubine's access could be personal and immediate. The king might see her in the quiet hours between public duties, talk freely without the weight of protocol, and hear her opinions without the political theatre that accompanied official meetings. One mainstream historical fact here: in late medieval France, royal mistresses like Agnès Sorel were not only companions to the king, but also conduits for petitions. Nobles and even foreign envoys sometimes approached them directly, knowing that a word in the king's ear during a private moment could accomplish more than days of formal negotiation. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some courts, concubines were believed to have a kind of luck or blessing that softened the king's temper. Chronicles describe kings being in notably better moods after spending time with their favourites. So much so that certain petitioners would time their requests for the morning after a concubine was known to visit the royal bedchamber. Back in the queen's chambers, the distinction between her influence and a concubine's becomes sharper. The queen must maintain dignity at all costs. Her every move is a public act. She cannot be seen whispering privately to the king in the great hall or slipping him notes during a hunt. Her authority rests in her image, serene, unshakable, the living emblem of the monarchy's continuity. A concubine, however, can work in the realm of the informal. She can ask questions the queen cannot, about the king's fears, his frustrations, even his grudges. She can speak with a familiarity that strips away the layers of ceremony, addressing the man rather than the monarch. In an age when personal relationships often carried as much weight as written law, that kind of access could tilt the balance of power in subtle but profound ways. Imagine the court during a time of crisis, perhaps a rebellion on the western border, or a failed harvest, causing unrest among the towns. The queen attends council meetings as a silent observer, her face composed, her presence reminding the lords of the dynasty's stability. But that evening, in the privacy of his chambers, the king talks over his options with his concubine. She listens, offers sympathy, and then suggests a course of action that favours her family's interests, or advances her own allies. The king, swayed by her understanding and his trust in her, carries that idea into the next council session. This doesn't mean queens were powerless. Some wielded great behind-the-scenes influence, particularly those who acted as regents for underage sons or who had the political acumen to manage factions at court. But for many, especially younger queens still finding their footing, the formal structure of their role made it hard to compete with the immediacy of a concubine's council. There's also the matter of risk. If a queen pushed too hard against the king's decisions, she could be painted as overstepping her place, meddling in affairs unsuited to her sex. A concubine, free from the burden of official duties, could press the king far more directly without the same danger to her position, especially if their relationship was strong. You drift in thought to a royal feast, imagining the long trestle tables groaning under platters of roasted meats, spiced wine flowing in silver cups, and music filling the air. The queen sits beside the king at the head of the hall, speaking politely to the guests of honor. The concubine sits further down the table but catches the king's eye during the meal. Later, when the hall is quieter, she might join him in a side chamber, where the conversation turns from feasting to politics. It is in these liminal spaces, away from the ceremonial spotlight, that decisions can be nudged. One can see why nobles often resented concubines, not simply for their relationships with the king, but for the access and influence they enjoyed, without the responsibilities that came with a formal title. To those on the outside, it looked like an unfair advantage. To those inside the court, it was simply another facet of power politics. The queen's influence, meanwhile, could be strengthened or weakened by how she handled the presence of concubines. Some queens ignored them entirely, refusing to acknowledge their existence. Others, more strategically, cultivated polite relationships, turning potential rivals into allies. In a few cases, queens used concubines as intermediaries, passing suggestions through them to the king in moments when direct conversation was impossible. You walk through the imagined palace gardens again, where hedges rise high enough to shield private conversations. The queen might meet here with her ladies-in-waiting, sharing carefully measured words about the king's favourites. She knows the concubine hears whispers too. Sometimes these two women rivals on paper might share a temporary alliance against another court faction. In the chessboard of palace politics, even a concubine could become a valuable piece if it meant blocking a more dangerous opponent. The difference, always, is that the queen's role is bound to the crown. Her authority is defined by her marriage and her children, and she cannot simply walk away. The concubine's position is bound only to the king's favour. That makes her more vulnerable and more flexible. She can rise rapidly in influence, but she can fall just as quickly. The queen, by contrast, may see her influence diminish over time, but her title and position remain as long as the marriage endures. In this way, the medieval court was a place where two very different forms of power coexisted. The queen represented continuity, the concubine represented immediacy. One was the unshakable image on the coin, the other was the whisper in the ear. Both had their uses, and both could shape the course of a kingdom's history. And as you step back into the great hall in your mind, you see them both there. The queen in her high-backed chair, the concubine moving easily among the courtiers, each playing her part in the delicate performance of royal life. The king sits between them in the public imagination, but in reality he moves between them in different hours, different moods, drawing from each a different kind of counsel. In the end, the queen's limited direct authority made the presence of concubines almost inevitable. Where the ceremonial role left gaps, personal access filled them, and in the ever-shifting world of medieval politics, those private moments could carry the weight of nations. The scent in the great hall shifts as you wander toward a quieter corner, where the air is heavy with incense and the murmur of foreign tongues. This is where visiting envoys and their retinues are received when the king is not holding a formal audience. You imagine the scene: a merchant prince from Genoa, a Moorish emissary from Granada, a rugged delegation from the steppes, each group bringing exotic goods, intricate gifts, and sometimes people. Among these human offerings were women presented as tokens of peace, tributes of loyalty, or gifts of honor to the king. In the complex language of diplomacy, such gifts could carry meanings as weighty as gold or land. Foreign concubines were not simply pretty faces, they were living symbols of political agreements. A woman from a distant court could embody a new alliance, or the end of a long feud. Her presence in the palace was a constant reminder to the king, his court, and visiting dignitaries of the connection between two realms. A gift of horses could be sold, jewels could be worn and forgotten, but a living person in the king's household was an ongoing piece of political theatre. One mainstream historical fact here: in the Mongol court of Kublai Khan, diplomatic marriages and gifts of noble women from vassal states were common, binding the court into a network of loyalty and obligation. While not all of these women were concubines in the European sense, many occupied a similar role as political partners, without the full title of queen or wife. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some medieval courts, the gift of a concubine came with a specific set of instructions for her care and wardrobe, meant to display her native culture. This was less about courtesy and more about showing off the alliance, dressing her in her homeland styles, so she remained a walking emblem of foreign connection. Picture the moment of her arrival. The great gates of the castle swing open. The envoys enter with their gifts, and among the bolts of silk and trays of spices, there's a young woman whose life has just changed forever. She may not speak the local language. She may not know the customs of the court, yet she will now live at its center, watched by everyone, her every gesture a political message. Her quarters are often decorated to reflect her origin, perhaps carpets from her homeland, or furniture in the style of her people. These are not purely for her comfort, they are set pieces for diplomacy. When foreign envoys visit, they can be shown the royal household's honoured guest, living in splendour, proof that their ruler's gift has been well received and given pride of place. Her role extends beyond the king's private life. She might act as an informal translator, a conduit for cultural exchange, or even a source of intelligence about her homeland's politics. In some cases, she might maintain correspondence with her family or former court, offering insights into the mood of her new kingdom, an early form of soft diplomacy. The queen's feelings towards such a concubine could be complicated. On one hand, the woman was a rival for the king's attention. On the other, she was a political instrument, as much a part of statecraft as a treaty. Some queens might even receive these women personally upon their arrival, a calculated show of grace that bolstered their own reputation as skilled hostesses and shrewd players in the political game. But acceptance didn't always come easily. Language barriers could breed mistrust. Cultural differences in dress, manners, or religion could spark quiet ridicule among courtiers. For the foreign concubine, survival meant adapting, learning the local tongue, mastering court etiquette, and making allies among the king's attendants and other influential figures. You picture her first appearance at a feast. The hall is crowded, the air thick with the smell of roasting meats and the heat of hundreds of candles. The king gestures for her to sit nearby. Whispers race down the table. Her gown is cut differently, her jewelry unlike anything seen before. To some she is a marvel, to others an interloper. Every bite she takes, every smile she offers, is noted and interpreted. The king's favour toward her could signal his priorities to the court. If he seated her prominently and showered her with gifts, it might mean that alliance with her homeland was critical, or that her personal influence on him was already strong. If her appearances were rare and carefully staged, she might be meant as a quiet symbol rather than an active presence in politics. Foreign concubines could also bring new customs into the royal household. A Moorish concubine might introduce perfumes and cosmetics unknown to the local nobility. A Byzantine-born mistress might popularize certain styles of embroidery or table service. These influences, at first exotic novelties, could become permanent fixtures of court culture, rippling outward into the fashions of the nobility and eventually the common people. One striking element of this practice was how it blurred the lines between personal and political relationships. For the king, a foreign concubine might be both a diplomatic asset and a source of genuine companionship. For her, the role could mean safety and luxury, compared to a life in her homeland, or it could mean isolation and constant scrutiny. In some instances, these women bore children who were seen as especially valuable because of their mixed heritage. Such children could claim blood ties to two realms, making them ideal candidates for bridging alliances through marriage. A son of the king and a foreign concubine might be sent back to his mother's homeland to rule as a client king. A daughter could be married into another noble house, doubling the web of alliances. The political weight of such relationships sometimes outlasted the king himself. If a foreign concubine had borne him a child who held a claim or position, she might remain in the palace under the next ruler, a living reminder of her homeland's enduring link to the royal family. You imagine her walking through the palace gardens on a spring morning, perhaps with a lady-in-waiting who speaks her language, pausing to admire flowers that don't grow in her native land. Servants bow as she passes, some out of duty, others out of genuine admiration. Behind her, in the shade, a pair of courtiers debate whether her homeland will send troops in the coming war, and whether her presence here will make the difference. This blending of personal and political life wasn't limited to Europe. In many Asian courts, the gifting or exchange of women for royal households was a long-standing practice. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, women from across the empire and beyond entered the Sultan's harem, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through tribute. These women could wield remarkable influence if they captured the ruler's attention, shaping policy far from their places of birth. Back in your imagined medieval palace, the foreign concubine's quarters are a place of duality, part private sanctuary, part political stage. Her attendants help her navigate local customs, translate court gossip, and ensure she is dressed and presented in ways that please both the king and the image makers of the court. She is, in every sense, a performance, a living emblem of a relationship between two powers. And yet, she is also a person, adapting to a life she may not have chosen. At night, when the torches burn low and the palace quiets, she might think of her family far away, of the language she now hears less often, of the streets and seasons of her homeland. In those moments, she is not a symbol or a gift, just a woman in a strange land, trying to shape her place in a world that watches her every move. The presence of foreign concubines beside medieval queens wasn't merely a matter of romance or indulgence. It was the embodiment of politics in human form, a reminder that in the medieval world, alliances were not abstract agreements. They were living, breathing, and often walking the corridors of the palace. The hall is lively again, in your mind. Minstrels tuning their lutes, courtiers exchanging murmured gossip, and a faint scent of spiced wine drifting through the air. But this time, your attention shifts to the concubine, not as a figure of beauty or diplomacy, but as a political player in her own right. Behind the silks and soft smiles, some of these women were power brokers, steering the currents of court affairs with as much calculation as any minister or nobleman. It's easy to imagine the scene. The king sits in a carved, high-backed chair near the hearth, the day's business weighing heavily on his shoulders. A dispute between two powerful lords threatens to boil over into violence. The treasury is strained by the costs of war. The queen will hear of these matters through formal channels, perhaps days later. The concubine, however, hears of them tonight, from the king himself, perhaps over a quiet quatter in her apartments. She listens, offers her thoughts, and plants a suggestion. By morning, her words have blended with the king's own ideas, and when the royal council meets, it is her influence that shapes the decision. One mainstream historical fact here: Diane de Poitiers, the famous mistress of King Henry II of France, wielded enormous political influence, though technically from the Renaissance period. Her role reflected patterns established in earlier medieval courts. She brokered alliances, advised on appointments, and even influenced foreign policy, demonstrating that a royal mistress could act as a de facto minister without ever holding an official title. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some medieval courts, the concubine's role in political maneuvering was so accepted that courtiers would send her lavishly decorated food trays, not for her to eat, but as bribes wrapped in the polite fiction of a gift. A beautifully iced cake or a carved sugar sculpture could be a coded message: remember me when you speak to the king. This influence wasn't always obvious. A skilled concubine understood that open interference in matters of state could provoke resentment from the king's advisors or even the queen. Instead, she worked through suggestion, timing, and selective omission. If she knew the king was already inclined toward a particular course of action, she could re-enhance his confidence in that choice. If she sensed hesitation, she could plant doubts or offer alternatives that aligned with her own interests. In the labyrinth of court politics, information was power, and concubines often sat at the crossroads of information flow. Courtiers eager for the king's favor would talk to her, confiding in hopes she'd pass along their words. Servants, overlooked by the great lords, might share snippets of overheard conversation, knowing she could reward them with coins, clothes, or influence. Over time, she could amass a network of informants that rivaled, or even surpassed, the official channels of the king's ministers.
You imagine her moving through the great hall, pausing to speak to a knight just back from the borderlands, then to a merchant whose ships have been delayed in port. Each encounter looks casual, almost social, but she is collecting details, mapping the kingdom's tensions and opportunities in her mind. Later, in the privacy of her chambers, she chooses which threads to weave into conversation with the king.
This role as an unofficial advisor could be particularly important in times of factional struggle. In a court divided between rival noble houses, the king's decisions might tip the balance of power in dangerous ways. The concubine, depending on her loyalties, might subtly champion one faction over another, or position herself as a neutral mediator, protecting her own survival by avoiding deep entanglements. But some concubines did more than advise. They actively orchestrated outcomes. In a medieval court, where appointments and honors could make or break a family's fortunes, she might advocate for a particular candidate to become chamberlain, marshal, or chancellor. A word from her could accelerate a promotion or stall a rival's advancement. In this way, she could build a cadre of allies who owed their positions to her intervention. Her power could also extend to matters of marriage, arranging or discouraging unions between key noble families. By influencing these alliances, she could strengthen her allies' positions and weaken her enemies. A clever match could bind a potential threat to her supporters. A thwarted one could prevent a rival from consolidating too much influence. One particularly delicate area was the dispensing of royal pardons. When nobles or wealthy merchants fell afoul of the law, they might seek the concubine's help in securing clemency. In exchange, they could offer favors, gifts, or loyalty. Such transactions were rarely recorded, but were part of the unspoken economy of influence that ran parallel to official governance. The queen, observing all this, might respond in different ways. Some queens fought to limit a concubine's access to the king's ear, arranging the schedule so that formal councils followed closely after royal suppers, leaving little room for private influence. Others sought to outmaneuver the concubine by cultivating their own networks of informants and allies, turning the palace into a constant arena of strategic rivalry. Yet, not all concubines sought power for its own sake. For some, wielding influence was a means of securing safety for themselves, for their children, and for their family back home. In the volatile environment of a medieval court, where a single change in favor could mean exile or worse, having loyalists in key positions was as much a shield as it was a weapon. You picture a winter's evening in the palace. Snow falls silently outside the windows, candles flicker in brass holders, and the king visits his concubine's chambers after a tense day in council. He speaks of a troublesome lord, of shortages in the army's supplies, of rumors from a neighboring kingdom. She listens, pours him warm wine, and tells him what he wants to hear, and what he needs to hear. In her mind, she is not merely passing the time with him, she is steering the ship of state one degree at a time. In some courts, the role of a politically active concubine could become so entrenched that her departure, whether through dismissal, marriage, or death, created a visible vacuum in the king's decision-making. New favourites might rise quickly to fill that gap, but it often took time for them to develop the same networks of trust and influence. You walk with her, in imagination, into the chapel for morning prayers. Her presence here is noted by the courtiers who watch her kneel, head bowed, but also by the bishop who knows she has the king's ear. After the service, perhaps she speaks with him briefly, a quiet conversation about the king's mood, or the church's needs. Even piety can be a political tool in skilled hands. It's easy to forget, when thinking about medieval politics, that so much of it was conducted in these informal spaces, in corridors, gardens, antechambers, and bedchambers, far from the grand tables where treaties were signed. The concubine's political power rested precisely in her ability to operate in those spaces, where decisions could be shaped before they were ever formally proposed. And so, while the queen might preside over public ceremonies in brocade and jewels, the concubine might be whispering the words that determined who sat on the council bench, who commanded the armies, and who paid the penalties for disloyalty. The court might not always admit her role openly, but its members recognized her as a force to be reckoned with. For the concubine herself, this influence could be intoxicating, but also dangerous. The same lords who courted her favor could turn against her if they suspected her of playing both sides. A failed political gamble could cost her everything. The higher she climbed, the sharper the drop beneath her feet. Still, for those who mastered the game, the rewards were considerable. Wealth, security, a lasting place in the kingdom's history. Even if the chroniclers downplayed her role, her fingerprints could be found on the events that shaped the realm, in the appointments made, the alliances forged, and the conflicts avoided or provoked. As you leave this imagined scene, the great hall seems to hum with a deeper understanding. The concubine is no longer just a figure of beauty or romance. She is a player in the highest stakes game of all, her influence woven invisibly into the kingdom's fate. The queen wears the crown, but in certain moments the concubine may hold the kingdom's rudder, guiding it, for better or worse, through the tempests of medieval politics. The scene in your mind shifts now, from the murmur of intrigue to the more practical and unglamorous side of keeping concubines. The economics of it all. In a medieval court, the king's favour came at a cost, and maintaining a secondary household for one or more concubines was no small expense. It wasn't simply a matter of feeding and clothing them, it was about sustaining an entire microcosm of luxury, status, and influence, a small court within the larger one, and doing so in a way that reflected the king's own magnificence. Step into the imagined gallery, where records are kept, and you'd find pages of expenditures written in a precise, cramped hand by the royal treasurer. There's a line for gowns of Florentine silk, embroidered with gold thread, another for chamber tapestries depicting the hunt, and yet another for monthly allowance to the Lady Eleanor's household. These entries weren't modest sums. For a favoured concubine, the outlay could rival and sometimes exceed the spending on minor nobility. One mainstream historical fact here. In 14th century England, royal mistresses such as Alice Perrers, companion to Edward III, received not only jewels and gowns, but also estates, manors, and lucrative positions like wardships over wealthy orphans. The Crown's treasury directly funded this lifestyle, and the grants were recorded as official royal acts. And here's your quirky tidbit: some concubines, especially in French and Burgundian courts, were given their own cooks and kitchen staff, whose job was to create dishes to please the ladies' humours. This meant that, while the rest of the palace ate the day's standard roast and pottage, her table might feature delicacies like candied almonds, imported citrus, or pastries shaped like swans. The core of this expense was the separate establishment a concubine required. She might have apartments within the main palace, or a separate residence nearby. Either way, those quarters needed to be staffed. Maids, footmen, a personal confessor, a wardrobe mistress, and guards. Each servant had to be paid, housed, and fed, often at royal expense. Gifts to those servants were another ongoing cost. Keeping them loyal and discreet was essential to preserving the concubine's standing. Then there were the seasonal expenses. In winter, extra firewood and furs for warmth. In summer, lighter silks, perfumes to combat the smells of heat, and perhaps even portable awnings or parasols for garden walks. A concubine's comfort wasn't just a matter of kindness. It was a statement of the king's wealth and his ability to provide for those closest to him. You can picture the storerooms bustling with activity, bolts of velvet being unpacked from a merchant's cart, chests of spices arriving from distant ports, artisans delivering jewellery or inlaid combs. Each of these items would be carried to the concubine's rooms, noted by her steward, and either worn immediately or stored for the right occasion. The financial burden extended beyond the concubine herself. If she had children by the king, their upbringing required tutors, nurses, and sometimes entirely separate households. Even if illegitimate, these children were often raised in comfort, their education and prospect reflecting the king's acknowledgement of them. This meant land grants, dowries for daughters, and the costs of outfitting sons for military or clerical careers. Nobles often grumbled about the strain these expenses placed on the royal treasury. After all, the money spent on maintaining a concubine's luxuries could have funded a new ship, fortified a castle, or paid soldiers' wages. Yet for the king, this spending was not wasteful, it was investment. The splendour surrounding his favourites was another form of propaganda, proof to foreign envoys and domestic rivals alike that he commanded the resources to lavish gifts without thought to cost. Some concubines turned these resources into long-term wealth. Land grants could be leased for income. Gold and jewels could be quietly sold or pawned during leaner years. A clever concubine might even act as a patron, loaning money to courtiers at interest, thereby building a web of debt and obligation that outlasted her time in the king's bedchamber. One can imagine the delicate balance between generosity and politics. Too many extravagant gifts to a concubine could spark resentment in the queen's faction, fuel satirical songs among the common folk, or give enemies ammunition to accuse the king of neglecting the realm. But too little display could undermine the concubine's status, making her seem less favoured and therefore less influential. To manage these optics, some kings disguised their largesse as official appointments. A concubine might be granted the revenues from a certain town's market tolls, or the right to collect rents from a royal estate. On paper, it was an administrative decision. In reality, it was a steady income stream to fund her lifestyle without constant withdrawals from the treasury. You walk through the imagined chambers of one such favoured woman. Her floors are strewn with rushes scented with herbs. On the walls, tapestries show scenes of chivalry or gardens in bloom. A gilded coffer at the foot of her bed overflows with brocade gowns, some still folded in protective linen. On her dressing table lie combs of ivory, bottles of scented oil, and rings set with garnets and pearls. Each object is a line in the treasurer's ledger, and each one a visible sign of the king's favour. The economics of concubinage also involved patronage in the arts. A king might commission a poem, song, or painting in honour of his mistress, further cementing her place in court culture. The cost of such works could be considerable, especially if the artist was renowned, but the reward was a lasting image of beauty and power that could shape public perception for years. Sometimes these expenses became points of contention in moments of political crisis. During wartime, when taxes rose and supplies ran short, the sight of a concubine glittering in jewels could turn popular opinion against the crown. Chroniclers, hostile to a king, might exaggerate the sums spent on his favourites, portraying them as symbols of decadence and neglect. And yet, even under such scrutiny, few kings abandoned the practice. The benefits of maintaining a concubine, in loyalty, companionship, and sometimes political leverage, were seen as worth the cost. The money was a visible investment in the image of royal abundance, a subtle reminder that the king's household operated on a scale far beyond that of any noble in the realm. You picture a banquet where this message is made explicit. The queen sits in her rightful place at the king's side, wearing a crown heavy with gems. A few seats down, the concubine wears a gown of deep crimson velvet, the fabric shimmering in the torchlight. Her necklace, a chain of gold hung with sapphires, catches the eye of every courtier. Each jewel, each stitch, each imported spice in the dishes before her is a coin spent from the royal treasury, and each one silently says, "This is how much I can give." The economics extended beyond the palace walls. Merchants supplying the concubine's needs could grow wealthy through royal contracts. Tailors, goldsmiths, perfumers and musicians all benefited from her patronage. In this way, the concubine's presence could stimulate certain trades, creating economic ripples that reached far beyond her own household. It's not hard to see why some families actively encouraged their daughters to seek the king's favour. The financial security and influence that came with the position could transform an entire lineage's fortunes. Estates could be expanded, debts repaid, and younger siblings married advantageously, all thanks to the wealth flowing from the concubine's rooms. Of course, the flow could stop suddenly. A fall from favour meant the closing of coffers, the dismissal of staff, and sometimes the loss of granted lands. Wise concubines planned for this possibility, saving wealth in portable forms, jewels that could be hidden, coin hoards discreetly managed by family members, and legal documents securing land in their own names. You leave this imagined chamber and return to the echoing corridors of the palace. The tap of your footsteps seems to blend with the imagined scratch of the treasurer's quill, tallying the costs that kept this delicate system running. In the cold logic of medieval kingship, the price of a concubine's maintenance was simply another line in the vast ledger of ruling, alongside the upkeep of armies, the construction of fortifications, and the hosting of grand feasts. The economy of concubinage, like everything else in the court, was a performance. Every coin spent, every gown stitched, every jewel set was part of the grand display of power, meant to dazzle allies, intimidate rivals, and remind the world that the king's resources were as boundless as his will. The air in your imagined palace feels charged now, like the moments before a summer storm. Behind the guilt and ceremony, the coexistence of queen and concubines was rarely an entirely calm affair. Sometimes the tension was subtle, a quick glance at a feast table, a pause too long in the great hall, and sometimes it was an open, grinding rivalry played out in the full view of the court. Queens and concubines could circle each other like wary predators, each keenly aware that the king's attention was the most valuable currency in the realm. It wasn't simply jealousy in the romantic sense, though that could spark in moments. The queen's rivalry with concubines was rooted in power, status, and survival. As the king's wife, the queen's authority came from her public role, her lineage, and the legitimacy she brought to the dynasty. The concubine's influence, on the other hand, came from private intimacy and personal favour, fragile in theory, but potent in practice. If the king began taking counsel more often from a concubine than from his queen, or if gifts and honours flowed too freely in her direction, the Queen's prestige could visibly diminish. One mainstream historical fact here: Isabella of France, Queen to Edward II of England, famously clashed with her husband's favourites, not romantic concubines in her case, but politically powerful companions like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. Chroniclers note how Edward's favouritism humiliated her and undermined her standing at court, an echo of the tensions queens experienced when their rivals were women. And here's your quirky tidbit. In certain medieval courts, ladies competed not only for the king's affection, but for the first right of the greeting, the privilege of being the first to approach and speak to him each morning in public. That tiny ceremonial moment could signal to the entire court who held the strongest sway over his mood that day. You picture a royal feast where these undercurrents bubble just beneath the surface. The Queen sits in her high-backed chair beside the king, dressed in brocade stitched with gold. Down the table, a concubine in crimson velvet catches the king's eye. A smile passes between them, just enough for the courtiers to notice. Across the hall, whispers begin, some amused, some sharp with disapproval. The Queen sees it too, and while her face remains a mask of serene dignity, her fingers tighten slightly around the stem of her goblet. The Queen's responses to such moments varied widely. Some chose to ignore the slight entirely, relying on their untouchable position as the king's lawful wife. Others retaliated through their own networks, using loyal ladies-in-waiting or sympathetic nobles to spread rumors about a concubine's manners, morals, or family background. A concubine who was painted as indiscreet, grasping, or politically dangerous could quickly lose ground in the court's shifting hierarchy. You wander mentally into the Queen's private apartments, where the air smells faintly of rosewater. She sits with her embroidery, a circle of trusted women around her. The conversation is quiet, but beneath the polite talk lies strategy. Who spoke to the king today? What gifts have been sent to his favourites? Which noble houses are aligning with which women? The Queen's chambers are not just a place of domesticity, they are a war room, and the campaigns here are waged in subtle gestures and carefully timed words. Concubines, for their part, were rarely passive targets. Many knew they were walking a narrow path, and learned to parry the Queen's unspoken challenges with their own quiet manoeuvres. A well-timed gift to the Queen, a jewel from the king, presented with exaggerated humility for instance, could be both a peace offering and a reminder that the concubine's connection to the monarch was strong enough to pass through his wife's hands. The court itself acted as both audience and amplifier to this rivalry. Servants, minor nobles, and visiting envoys all had a stake in interpreting which woman's influence was rising and which was fading. A concubine seated prominently at a banquet or invited to ride beside the king in a hunt was seen as ascendant. A queen who managed to host a grand feast without her rival present could signal that she still controlled the social stage. One of the more perilous arenas for this rivalry was in matters of the king's children. If a concubine bore the king a son, the queen might face the delicate task of publicly acknowledging the child without letting him overshadow her own offspring. If the queen's children were young or absent from court, a charming and well-mannered child from a concubine could subtly shift loyalties among the courtiers. Queens sometimes countered this by arranging highly visible displays of their own children's health, intelligence, and courtly training, turning the upbringing of heirs and spares into a form of political theatre. It's easy to imagine how the smallest incidents could become loaded with meaning. A concubine, wearing a gown in the same colour as the queen's on a feast day, could be seen as a deliberate challenge. A queen declining to attend a hunt where the concubine was riding might be interpreted as disapproval. In such a charged environment, even an accidental seating arrangement could ignite weeks of gossip. Some queens chose a different tactic altogether: calculated tolerance. By treating the concubine with measured courtesy, they could appear magnanimous while keeping their true feelings and strategies hidden. In rare cases, this approach even led to working alliances, particularly if the queen saw the concubine as a useful intermediary with the king. The enemy you can predict, after all, is often safer than the one you cannot. You walk, in your mind, into a smaller chamber off the main hall, where a concubine meets with her own circle of confidant. Here, the conversation is equally strategic. Which lords are leaning toward the queen's faction? Which are seeking favour through her? Which household servants are reliable informants? In this quieter space, She rehearses her public demeanor, ensuring that every smile, every word at the next banquet will serve her goals. The rivalry could escalate when external politics entered the mix. If the queen was from a powerful foreign family, any insult to her might have diplomatic consequences. Conversely, if the concubine came from an influential noble house, alienating her could fracture the king's support among the lords. In such cases, the rivalry wasn't merely personal, it was a potential threat to the stability of the realm. You recall how, in certain courts, this tension even seeped into public entertainments. At tournaments or masques, allegorical performances might subtly reference the battle between lawful authority and dangerous beauty. The audience, courtiers and foreign guests alike, would nod knowingly at the veiled metaphors, each interpreting them according to their own loyalties. Over time, these rivalries left marks in the historical record, though often in the form of biased chronicles or courtly gossip rather than official accounts. Chroniclers sympathetic to the queen might portray concubines as manipulative and vain. Those loyal to the king's favourites might paint queens as cold, joyless, or politically meddlesome. Through these lenses, the reality of their interactions was often distorted, but the intensity of the rivalry was unmistakable. The personal stakes for both women were enormous. For the queen, losing influence could mean her children's futures were endangered, her political allies weakened, and her own position made precarious. For the concubine, falling out of favour could mean losing everything: wealth, security, and the protection of the king's attention. You return to the imagined great hall at the moment the king enters. The queen and concubine both present. One stands to greet him first. The other waits. And in that tiny choreography, the court reads 100 possible meanings. The king smiles, oblivious or perhaps fully aware of the silent game being played around him. The feast begins, but for those attuned to the currents beneath the music and laughter, the real contest is only just starting. In the charged coexistence of queen and concubines, every feast, hunt, procession and council meeting became a stage. The rivalry wasn't always open warfare. Often it was a slow dance of maneuver and counter-maneuver, each woman guarding her position while testing the limits of the others. And in this dance, the king's attention was both the prize and the weapon, shaping the lives of everyone in the palace. The tension you've been tracing through these palace corridors now collides with another layer of medieval life. The question of morality, or at least the official version of it, and how kings justified the keeping of concubines under the watchful eyes of the church and other religious authorities. It's one thing to navigate jealous queens and scheming courtiers. It's another to navigate the pulpit and the pen of an archbishop. Medieval Europe was, on the surface, a deeply Christian world. Marriage was considered a sacred sacrament, not just a legal contract. Adultery, in theory, was a sin for both men and women. But in practice, the moral rules applied to a king could be bent until they looked suspiciously like privileges. One mainstream historical fact here: King Philip IV of France faced murmurs from clergy over his mistresses, yet his reign saw little direct interference from the papacy on the matter. This wasn't because the church approved, it was because a king's military, political and financial power often made the hierarchy think twice before picking a fight that could destabilize a realm. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some courts, confessors assigned to kings were chosen as much for their political loyalty as for their piety, ensuring that any advice about concubines was phrased as spiritual guidance rather than moral condemnation. A gentle nudge to keep the queen publicly honoured could substitute for a sermon on chastity. You can imagine the palace chapel on a feast day, the air heavy with incense, the flicker of candles throwing shadows across gilded altarpieces. The queen kneels in her place, her ladies beside her. The king kneels opposite, perhaps with a favoured concubine among the other court ladies, head bowed in apparent devotion. The priest offers a homily on faithfulness, but his eyes slide briefly toward the monarch, the message unspoken but understood. The official workaround for kings was often to frame concubinage not as open defiance of Christian morality, but as an unfortunate necessity, a way to ensure heirs, to keep the king's natural vigour from leading him into more scandalous or destabilising affairs, or to provide companionship when the queen's duties, such as periods of post-childbirth recovery, kept her apart from him. Some leaned on Old Testament precedent. After all, Solomon had wives and concubines by the hundreds. David had his share as well. These biblical examples could be twisted into a kind of moral loophole. If great kings of Israel had concubines, then surely the sin was not in the keeping of them, but in failing to govern justly alongside them. In kingdoms where Christian and Islamic worlds met, in Iberia, Sicily, and parts of the Crusader states, the contrast in marital customs could be even sharper. Muslim rulers could have multiple wives and concubines openly under Islamic law, which recognized the legitimacy of such arrangements. Christian kings who dealt with these courts sometimes found themselves explaining or downplaying their own practices, to avoid looking less manly in the eyes of their rivals. There were, of course, church leaders who criticized concubinage outright. Moralistic sermons in cathedral cities would warn against the corruption of the royal household, claiming that the king's example could lead the common people astray. These criticisms could gain traction in times of famine, war, or high taxation, when the people's patience for royal indulgences wore thin. The queen might seize on such moments to push for the dismissal of a rival, using religious rhetoric to cloak personal and political motives. But religion could also be used to shield concubines. A king might ensure his favourite made generous donations to churches, sponsored the building of chapels, or supported local monasteries. These acts of public piety could be paraded before the court as proof of her virtue, even if everyone knew she shared the king's bed. In some cases, the concubine's reputation for charity outlived the scandal of her position, winning her a surprisingly fond place in local memory. Imagine the concubine attending mass in a gown of modest cut, her veil drawn low, while poor women approach her after the service to petition for aid. She listens, promises assistance, and later sends alms from her household's coffers. The chroniclers might omit her name from royal rolls, but the townsfolk remember her as the lady who paid for the repair of the church roof, or the feeding of orphans in a harsh winter. There were also subtler moral loopholes. In some regions, concubines could be given a form of legal acknowledgement through contracts that granted them protection, property, or the right to remain in royal service even after the king's death. These agreements skirted around the church's disapproval by treating the relationship as a kind of semi-official arrangement, not a marriage but not entirely illicit either. In a few unusual cases, queens themselves invoked religion to accommodate a concubine's presence. If a queen was ill, aging, or unable to bear more children, she might publicly embrace a pious narrative that the concubine was helping to secure the realm by ensuring the king's line. It was a magnanimous fiction, but in a world where political stability was bound to dynastic continuity, it could win her points for self-sacrifice in the eyes of the court. The clergy, for their part, often walked a fine line. Bishops who needed the king's favour for church lands or privileges might temper their criticism. Those with ties to the queen's family might preach a sharper message. Parish priests, far removed from court politics, might rail against the moral decay of the nobility without naming names, knowing that the gist would reach their congregation's ears. You can almost hear the marketplace talk after such sermons. Bakers, merchants, and washerwomen discuss how the priest meant the king without saying so, and debate whether God will punish the realm for its monarch's private sins. In this way, the morality of concubinage wasn't just a matter for theologians, it was a public conversation, woven into the kingdom's everyday life. Interestingly, moral tolerance could ebb and flow with the king's fortunes. A beloved and successful ruler could keep concubines without much pushback, his victories and prosperity washing away complaints, but let the treasury run dry. Lose a war, or fail to protect the realm from famine, and suddenly the concubines became symbols of decadence and misrule. One can imagine a skilled concubine sensing these shifts. In times of public unrest, she might step back from public appearances, dress more modestly, or increase her charitable works. When the king's popularity rebounded, she could re-emerge in greater splendor. This ability to read the moral temperature of the realm could mean the difference between survival and sudden exile. The justifications kings used to keep concubines were, at their heart, pragmatic. They leaned on precedent, necessity, political advantage, and public piety, bending the rigid framework of medieval Christian morality until it fit the contours of their own desires and needs. The church might frown, But unless a concubine threatened the kingdom's political stability or the queen's family's influence, outright condemnation was rare. And so, in the cathedral's shadow, and under the watchful eyes of painted saints, concubines continue to walk the palace halls, their presence explained away in sermons, defended in council chambers, and quietly accepted by those who understood that in the medieval world, morality was often what power said it was. The tone of the palace changes when war drums echo across the kingdom. The soft chatter of feasts gives way to the clang of armor, the smell of oiled leather, and the heavy tread of messengers hurrying through corridors. In such moments, the lives of everyone in the royal household shift, and concubines, though often thought of as luxuries for peacetime, did not simply fade into the background when the banners were called. When a king marched to war, he carried with him more than swords and men. He carried the symbols of his authority. Sometimes, that included the presence of a favored concubine in certain courts, especially where the queen could not accompany the army for reasons of ceremony, politics, or health. A concubine might serve as the king's companion on campaign. This was not simply indulgence. Her presence could lift his spirits, give him trusted counsel in the quiet moments, and even serve as a reminder to his men of the king's vitality and confidence. One mainstream historical fact here: during the 100 Years' War, it was not unheard of for royal favourites, male and female, to accompany monarchs to the front, living in the fortified towns or travelling with the baggage train. While official chroniclers downplayed their presence, surviving letters and expenditure records reveal purchases for ladies' clothing, jewellery, and lodging in the midst of wartime movements. And here's your quirky tidbit: some concubines were known to send tokens to favoured knights before battles, embroidered sleeves, scarves, or even a ring, as symbols of luck. Whether or not these gestures truly swayed outcomes, they were remembered by the warriors who wore them into the fray. In the field, the concubine's duties shifted. Gone were the elaborate entertainments of the palace. Instead, she adapted to a world of tents, muddy roads, and the ever-present smell of horses. She might oversee the king's personal tent, ensuring he had privacy and comfort amid the chaos. She might help manage the household servants, who cooked, laundered, and maintained supplies for the royal party. And in moments when the king returned from battle, she was there to offer him a private space away from the demands of commanders and diplomats. Back at the capital, when the king was absent, concubines could play a different role altogether. If the queen acted as regent, she held formal power, but a favoured concubine who remained at court might still wield influence over those who wrote to the king or awaited his return. She could serve as a gatekeeper for petitions, deciding which matters merited his attention in his correspondence. Her letters to him, often carried by trusted couriers, might carry tidings from the court that shaped his decisions far from home. You imagine her seated at a writing desk in a chamber warmed by a small brazier, penning a careful account of palace events, which lords had visited, what rumours were circulating, and which ministers seemed most loyal to the Queen's regency. Between the lines, subtle hints might suggest who deserved rewards or which rival should be watched. She knows the king will read her words in the lamplight of his campaign tent, and that they will colour his perception of the home front. Concubines could also serve as informal diplomats during wartime. If the queen's role was to receive ambassadors in the throne room, a concubine might meet them in less formal settings, a hunt, a private supper, where guarded words could be exchanged without the weight of ceremony. Foreign envoys sometimes courted their favour, hoping they might whisper a favourable word to the king upon his return. When war came to the palace itself, as in sieges or civil uprisings, the line between ceremonial and practical roles blurred. Queens were expected to rally defences and inspire loyalty. Concubines, less bound by public expectation, could take on unexpected tasks, smuggling messages past enemy lines, negotiating secretly with faction leaders, or even helping disguise and hide valuables from looters. In times of siege, their very presence could be a political tool. If the enemy believed a favoured concubine was inside the walls, they might use her as a bargaining chip in surrender negotiations. Conversely, if she was seen outside the city, safe under escort, her survival could signal that the king's inner circle remained intact despite the chaos. One can picture the tension in such a moment. The concubine, standing at a narrow window, looking down at the enemy campfires, dotting the night. The queen is elsewhere, perhaps in the chapel, praying for deliverance. Servants hurry through the corridors carrying water and arrows. Every sound is amplified. The crack of a bowstring, the crash of stones against the gate. In that suspended world, survival depends not on jewels or gowns, but on adaptability, quick thinking, and the ability to read danger in the smallest changes. War also altered the perception of concubines. In peacetime, they might be resented as frivolous drains on the treasury, but in wartime, if they proved resourceful, loyal, and brave, they could win respect even from rivals. Stories would spread of the king's favourite tending to wounded soldiers, raising funds for supplies, or sending her own jewellery to be melted down for coin. Whether these tales were true or crafted by supporters, they could soften public opinion and strengthen her position at court. Of course, war also brought risks. If the king was killed or captured, a concubine's fortunes could collapse overnight. Without his protection, she might face exile, imprisonment, or even violence from those who saw her as a symbol of his policies. Some managed to align themselves quickly with the new power, pledging loyalty to the queen or the heir, while others vanished into obscurity or fled abroad. The emotional toll of wartime life was heavy. Letters from absent kings could be infrequent and brief, leaving concubines to navigate months of uncertainty. Rumors of defeat or death could cause sudden panic in their households, and in the lonely hours when the palace was quiet, they might find themselves pacing the same corridors they had once walked in silks, now lined with armed guards and echoing with the distant thud of siege engines. You imagine a cold dawn after weeks of battle. The concubine steps into the courtyard to see soldiers returning from the walls, their armor dented, faces drawn. She moves among them, offering bread, speaking softly. Her presence a reminder of the human world beyond the fighting. Some look at her with suspicion, others with gratitude. But all know she carries the ear of the king, and that matters in a world where promises made in the dust of war can decide a family's fate. When the king finally returns from campaign, the reunions, public and private, can be politically charged. The queen greets him in the throne room, formal and regal. The concubine meets him later, perhaps in a quieter space, where the exchange of words, gifts, or even just a look can reset the balance of influence at court. Those who have been watching for months take careful note of which woman he lingers with longest, whose hand he holds in public, and which household gains new favour in the days after his arrival. War, in the medieval world, was a crucible that tested not only armies and kings, but everyone in their orbit. For concubines, it was a chance to prove loyalty, expand influence, and in rare cases, reshape how they were perceived by history. The ones who navigated this turbulent time successfully often emerged with stronger positions than they had before the first sword was drawn. And so, amid the clash of steel and the smoke of burning villages, the king's concubine might still be there. Not merely a figure of pleasure, but a companion in strategy, a keeper of secrets, and a survivor in a world where the tides of fortune could turn with the beat of a war drum. The palace quiets after the roar of war, yet some names carry on through the centuries. Concubines, whose lives left marks so deep that chroniclers, poets and gossiping courtiers could not forget them. These were not just shadows behind the throne, they were women whose beauty, cunning, or sheer force of personality shaped events, altered alliances, and became part of the legends of their age. Their stories differ in detail, but share common threads. Each navigated a court where danger and opportunity intertwined, and each left behind a legacy strong enough to survive the erosion of time.
One mainstream historical fact here. Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France in the 15th century, became one of the most famous royal favourites in European history. Not only was she openly acknowledged at court, but she also received lavish gifts, estates and the title Dame de Beauté. Chroniclers noted her influence over the king's decisions, and she set fashion trends, famously popularising low-cut gowns that scandalised and enthralled the court in equal measure.
And here's your quirky tidbit. It was whispered that Sorel kept a small lapdog, whose collar was studded with pearls, each supposedly worth enough to feed a peasant family for months. Whether true or embroidered by jealous tongues, the image stuck, turning her pet into part of her myth. You picture her in the great hall, light from the high windows spilling over her gown of pale blue satin. The queen is seated nearby, composed and regal, but the courtier's eyes flicker again and again towards Sorel. She knows they watch her. She smiles just enough, speaks just enough, offering neither fuel for scandal nor reason to dismiss her presence. In that careful balance, her power grows. Not all famous concubines were French. In medieval England, Alice Perrers rose from a relatively obscure background to become the mistress of Edward III in his later years. She wielded enormous influence over the king, particularly after the death of Queen Philippa. Alice was accused of using her position to amass wealth, including fine clothing, jewels and lands. After Edward's death, she faced legal challenges and political retribution, yet her name endures in records and legends as a woman who reached the pinnacle of court life without noble birth. In Castile, Leona de Guzman was the longtime mistress of King Alfonso XI. She bore him 10 children, many of whom became significant figures in Spanish politics. Leonor's influence was so great that she effectively rivaled the queen in power, and after the king's death, her enemies moved swiftly to eliminate her, fearing her continuing influence through her sons. Her fate was tragic, but her legacy shaped dynastic politics in Iberia for decades. Some famous concubines crossed the line from political influence into active governance. In certain courts of the Middle East and Asia, favoured women became regents, advisors, or even military patrons. While this was rarer in Christian Europe, the idea of a concubine as an active political player was not unthinkable, especially when the king trusted her judgment more than that of his ministers. Their legacies were often double-edged. Admirers praised their beauty, intelligence and loyalty. Detractors accused them of greed, manipulation, or moral corruption. Chroniclers, depending on their loyalties, might elevate them to near saintly figures or drag them through pages of vitriol. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. You wander mentally into a small palace library, where an illuminated manuscript lies open on a lectern. The text describes a royal feast decades past, where a certain lady sat at the king's right hand, wearing jewels like stars and speaking with wit that charmed even her enemies. The name is one you've seen before in multiple sources, sometimes spelled differently, sometimes surrounded by contradictory details, yet the essence remains: she mattered. It's worth remembering that fame itself was a form of power in the medieval world. A concubine, whose reputation reached foreign courts, could become a kind of informal ambassador. Kings and envoys arriving at court already knew her name, had heard tales of her beauty or influence, and approached her with gifts or petitions. In this way, her renown expanded her reach far beyond the palace walls. Sometimes, their influence survived them. Children born to famous concubines often carried the memory of their mother's position into their own careers, leveraging the prestige or notoriety of her name. A well-placed marriage for a daughter, a church position for a son, could continue the work she began, embedding her legacy in the very structure of the realm. Not all famous concubines were adored in their lifetimes. Jealous courtiers and rival factions sometimes painted them as omens of misrule. If a kingdom suffered famine, defeat in war, or political scandal, it was an easy leap to blame the king's mistress for distracting him from his duties or influencing bad decisions. Songs, plays and poems might lampoon her, turning private grievances into public mockery. And yet, even scandal could not always erase them. The mere fact that chroniclers bothered to record their existence, in an era when many noble women's names went unmentioned, speaks to the impact they made. In some cases, their stories were retold and reshaped in later centuries, romanticized into tragic heroines, or vilified as cunning seductresses, depending on the storyteller's taste. You picture the concubine walking through the palace gardens long after her peak influence, perhaps after the king's death. The younger courtiers may not know her full story, but the older ones remember the hunts she attended, the political appointments whispered to have passed through her hands, the jewels she wore at feasts. Even in decline, she is a figure from a living legend, her very presence a reminder of another era. There's also the question of how much these women shaped fashion and culture. Agnes Sorel's daring neckline was just one example. Others introduced new styles of hair, favoured certain colours, or brought foreign fabrics into vogue. Courtiers, eager to show they were in the king's inner circle, copied these trends, making them ripple outward into the noble and merchant classes. In this way, a concubine's personal taste could become part of the cultural identity of an entire court, and sometimes a whole kingdom. Fame also made them targets in times of regime change. When a king died, his widow's faction might move quickly to dismantle the influence of his favourite, confiscating her properties or expelling her from court. In some cases, she might retire to a convent, whether willingly or under pressure, preserving her dignity and safety while disappearing from the political stage. For others, exile to a distant estate offered a quieter end. Yet even in seclusion, stories about her would circulate. Visitors might describe her as still beautiful in her later years, or as having a sharp tongue when politics came up. These accounts kept her name alive, feeding the cycle of fascination that had begun in her youth. Some concubines even embraced their notoriety, using it to secure their place in history. Patronage of the arts, commissioning of religious works, and charitable acts could all be ways to ensure that their legacy was written in stone, sometimes literally, as with chapel dedications or engraved tombs. In the end, the famous concubines of the medieval world were neither entirely victims nor entirely victors. They were complex figures navigating a system that both empowered and endangered them. Their survival and the endurance of their names depended on their ability to blend charm, intelligence, and adaptability in an environment where fortunes could turn in a heartbeat. And so, centuries later, their stories still find you here in this imagined palace, standing between the queen's apartments and the king's private chambers, hearing the echo of footsteps that once belonged to women whose presence could change the course of kingdoms. Their beauty may have opened the door, but it was their ability to survive and to matter that kept them in the rooms where history was made. And here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of medieval France, it was considered good luck if a child, legitimate or not, sneezed loudly at their baptism. Chroniclers even recorded such moments, as if to suggest divine favour had just been signalled for the infant's future. In most courts, the fate of a concubine's child depended almost entirely on the king's decisions. He could acknowledge the child openly, grant them titles, and arrange for their education alongside noble children, or he could quietly distance himself, leaving the mother's family or a foster household to raise them. Official recognition, when it came, could change everything. A royal acknowledgement might lead to a comfortable position in the clergy, a military command, or a politically useful marriage. You picture a young boy of 10, hair the same shade as the king's, standing in the tiltyard watching older squires at their drills. His fine tunic and new boots mark him as someone of importance, even if his place in the line of succession is undefined. The master-at-arms nods to him, with respect, knowing the boy's father can change his fortunes with a single word. For daughters of concubines, marriage was the main path to securing their position. The king might arrange unions with loyal nobles, using his daughter's half-royal blood as a sweetener for alliances. Such marriages could create lasting bonds between the crown and regional powerhouses, and from the daughter's perspective, offered stability in a world where her mother's favour might not last forever. Yet danger always lurked. If a king died suddenly without securing his children's futures, those born outside of marriage could be swept aside by the new regime. A queen acting as regent for her own son might see the concubine's children as potential threats and arrange for them to be sent far from court, married off hastily, or eased into religious life. For sons, especially, the combination of royal blood and ambition could make them rallying points for rebellions, willingly or unwillingly. One can imagine the chill of such a moment. A concubine's teenage son summoned to the queen's chambers after his father's death. She smiles politely, speaks of his bright future, and informs him that he will take holy orders in a monastery far from the capital. The decision is couched in terms of honour and service, but everyone in the room understands it is also about removing him from the game board. Some illegitimate children found ways to thrive outside the direct sphere of succession. They became celebrated knights, respected abbots, or patrons of the arts. In doing so, they carried their father's bloodline into spaces that could strengthen the crown's influence indirectly. Others lived their lives in relative obscurity, their royal parentage an open secret in their local communities, but irrelevant to the broader politics of the realm. When tensions over legitimacy did arise, they could ignite entire wars. In kingdoms where succession laws were less rigid, a king might attempt to legitimize his favorite concubine's children, granting them equal inheritance rights with the queen's offspring. Such decisions almost always provoked fierce resistance from the queen's faction and the nobility, who saw their own positions threatened. Even without formal legitimization, a king's affection for a concubine's child could shape policy. A favored son might be given a plum governorship, access to military training, or funds for building a private household. These advantages could elevate him to a level of influence that rivaled or even surpassed legitimate princes, especially if the legitimate heirs were young, absent, or uninterested in governance. You picture a feast in the great hall. At the high table, the king raises a goblet to toast his beloved son. Seated just below him, the boy is dressed in a tunic embroidered with the royal crest, a privilege rarely granted to one of his birth. The queen's face is unreadable, but her allies around the hall are already calculating how this public display might shift the loyalties of the realm's lords. For the concubine herself, her children were often her most important political assets. She could use their education, marriages, and positions as levers to secure her own safety and influence. A son appointed to a key military post could defend her interests at court. A daughter married to a powerful ally could shield her from rivals. Through her children, she could weave a web of loyalty that outlasted her relationship with the king. In some cases, the children's own charisma or skill ensured their survival after their mother's decline. A clever young man might win favor directly with the queen or the new heir, sidestepping the political dangers that came from his parentage. A pious and well-connected daughter might become an abbess, controlling valuable lands and holding sway in religious politics. But the opposite could also happen. A child's misstep could drag down the mother's position. If a son gambled away lands, insulted an important noble, or appeared to challenge the legitimate heir, his mother could face exile or disgrace by association. In such a delicate world, a concubine's guidance of her children was as much a political art as it was maternal care. Some children of concubines left enduring legacies of their own, their illegitimacy fading into footnotes as their accomplishments defined them. Others became cautionary tales, reminders of how quickly fortune could turn when royal blood mixed with uncertain standing. You wander back into your imagined palace nursery, a warm, firelit room filled with the sound of children's voices. Here, legitimate and illegitimate siblings might play together in early years, oblivious to the sharp lines the world would later draw between them. A nurse hushes them when footsteps approach, the queen, perhaps, or the concubine, each woman keenly aware of the currents these children represent. In their small faces lies the future of the realm, and in their parentage lies the potential for unity or division. In the medieval court, blood was never just blood, it was currency, leverage, and a ticking clock. For the children of concubines, every step forward carried both privilege and peril, and for their mothers, each child was both a triumph and a risk. Living proof of the king's affection, and a constant reminder that the game they played was not only for themselves, but for generations to come. The palace you've been wandering in your mind has long, echoing corridors that connect not just rooms but strategies, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the way some queens chose to handle the presence of concubines. Rivalry was common, yes, but history also holds examples of queens who tolerated, and in some cases even leveraged, their husbands' lovers to strengthen their own positions. It was an exercise in survival, but also in political intelligence. For these queens, outright resistance was sometimes the least effective choice. A head-on challenge to the king over his concubine could damage the royal marriage publicly, alienate the king, and embolden political enemies. Instead, the queen might decide to co-opt the concubine, turning her from an adversary into a useful intermediary. This was especially tempting if the concubine came from a family whose loyalty was valuable, or if she had access to the king's unguarded moments in a way the queen could not match. One mainstream historical fact here: Eleanor of Aquitaine, while not known for encouraging her husband's mistresses, is a prime example of a queen who understood the value of building alliances through unconventional means. Chroniclers hint that she sometimes kept rivals closer rather than pushing them out, ensuring she could monitor and influence their actions instead of letting them operate entirely beyond her reach. And here's your quirky tidbit. In certain late medieval courts, there was an unspoken etiquette that a queen might send a small gift, such as a ring or fine cloth, to a newly favoured concubine, ostensibly as a gesture of welcome. The reality was more complicated. It was a subtle reminder that the queen was still the highest-ranking woman in the realm, and that the concubine's position existed only within the space she allowed. You can picture one such meeting. The queen receives the concubine in a side chamber, away from the eyes of the great hall. Both women are dressed in their finest, their smiles perfectly measured. The queen speaks warmly, even affectionately, asking after the concubine's health, her family, her lodgings. Beneath the pleasantries lies a quiet negotiation. The queen is assessing whether this woman can be molded into an ally, and the concubine is weighing whether alignment with the queen would protect her position or constrain it. When these arrangements worked, they could be remarkably effective. A concubine who enjoyed the queen's tolerance could act as a bridge to the king, carrying messages, tempering his anger, or smoothing over disputes before they became public crises. The queen, in turn, could use the concubine to test ideas or proposals, knowing the king might be more candid in private conversation than he would be in formal council. Some queens even used concubines to divert the king's attention away from more dangerous advisors or factions. If the king was enthralled by a woman who was loyal, or at least neutral toward the queen, that could be preferable to seeing him swayed by a scheming minister or an ambitious nobleman. In this way, the concubine became a kind of political shield, intentionally or not. It was also possible for a queen to leverage a concubine's influence for her own family's benefit. A queen might suggest to the concubine that the king appoint one of her brothers to a lucrative post or grant lands to a cousin, framing it as an idea that would please both women. If the concubine agreed and championed the request, the queen's goal was achieved without her having to risk her own direct appeal. In certain rare cases, queens and concubines formed genuine friendships. This was more likely when the concubine entered the king's household before the queen's marriage, and posed no threat to the legitimacy of the queen's children. The shared experience of navigating the king's moods and the court's politics could forge an unlikely camaraderie. These alliances were still strategic, but they could carry the warmth of mutual respect. You imagine a summer afternoon in the palace gardens. The queen and concubine walk side by side, ladies in waiting trailing at a respectful distance. They discuss a visiting envoy, the preparations for a feast, perhaps even the antics of the king's hunting party. Their conversation flows easily, their occasional laughter turning heads among the watching courtiers. No one can quite tell where genuine affection ends and political performance begins, and perhaps neither woman could say for sure. But tolerance was not without risks. A concubine who felt too secure in the queen's good graces might overstep, using her dual access to both monarchs to advance her own interests at the queen's expense. If such betrayal occurred, the fallout could be swift and brutal: dismissal from court, confiscation of property, or quiet exile to a distant estate. Queens who practiced tolerance had to remain vigilant, ready to reassert their dominance if the balance shifted too far. Some queens also used public displays to signal their acceptance of a concubine, seating her prominently at a feast, including her in processions, or allowing her to participate in charitable works alongside the queen's own household. All conveyed a message: this woman is under my protection. Such gestures could diffuse court gossip, making it harder for enemies to use the relationship as evidence of discord in the royal marriage. Even religious life could be enlisted in these strategies. A queen might encourage a concubine to sponsor a chapel or donate to a monastery, presenting the act as a joint effort. This not only improved the concubine's moral standing in the eyes of the clergy, but also tied her public image to the queen's, blurring the line between rival and ally. In some instances, queens who tolerated concubines did so out of sheer necessity. If a king was known for his wandering affections, constantly replacing one favourite with another, it might be wiser for the queen to form a stable working relationship with the current favourite, rather than oppose her. knowing that resistance could alienate the king without changing his behavior. There's a certain steely wisdom in this approach. The queen accepts that she cannot control the king's private desires, but she can influence the way those desires are expressed in the life of the court. By guiding or at least monitoring the concubine's role, she keeps her own authority intact and ensures that the royal household's public image remains as dignified as possible. You return to the imagined Great Hall, where the queen sits at the head of the table, the king beside her, and the concubine a few seats down. Conversation flows between them, passing over court politics, family news, and plans for a tournament. To the casual observer, all seems harmonious, but those who know the court understand the delicate choreography at work, the queen steering the tone, the concubine reinforcing it, the king enjoying the rare peace between two of the most influential women in his life. It's tempting to imagine that such cooperation was common, but in truth, it was exceptional, a testament to the political acumen of both women when it occurred. More often, the relationship between queen and concubine was a wary truce at best, yet in those cases where tolerance prevailed, it could create a stability that benefited not only the women themselves, but the entire realm. The medieval court was a place of endless calculation, and queens who learned to turn potential rivals into instruments of their own power demonstrated a level of skill equal to any statesman. They played the long game, using the concubine's proximity to the king as a channel rather than a threat. In doing so, they ensured that the crown and their own place beneath it rested more securely, no matter how the tides of favour shifted. The palace you've been walking through in your mind is beginning to change, not in its stones and chambers, but in the rules that govern it. The long tradition of royal concubinage in Europe, once taken for granted in many courts, did not vanish overnight. It ebbed, faltered, and finally receded under the pressure of shifting morals, changing laws, and new ideas about monarchy. By the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the old structures that had made concubines a normal part of royal life were steadily dismantled. At the heart of this decline was the tightening grip of religious doctrine. The medieval church had always frowned on adultery, but in earlier centuries monarchs could sidestep the issue with political influence, charitable acts, or the simple fact that kings were often untouchable. By the 15th and 16th centuries, however, the church's moral authority was more codified and more aggressively enforced. Reform movements within Christianity, some born inside the Catholic Church, others eventually breaking away, began insisting that rulers should serve as moral exemplars to their people. One mainstream historical fact here: the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, while post-medieval, formalized Catholic reforms that had been building for a century, stressing the sanctity of marriage and explicitly condemning extramarital relationships. In the decades leading up to it, similar sentiments were preached more forcefully, in pulpits and enshrined in royal propaganda. Kings, once praised for virility, were now more often praised for fidelity. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some European courts, satirists began composing humorous mock confessions for imaginary kings, in which the monarch admitted to keeping mistresses, only to be lectured by a talking animal or saint. These were passed around in manuscript form, and while comic, reflected a growing sense that public opinion could be swayed against the practice. It wasn't just the church that applied pressure. The very nature of monarchy was changing. In earlier medieval centuries, kings often had to court the loyalty of powerful nobles and regional magnates, using marriage, concubinage, and patronage as tools to bind allies. By the later medieval period, the central authority strengthened in many kingdoms. Monarchs had less need to spread influence through informal relationships. A stable bureaucracy and professionalized armies reduced the reliance on personal favors granted through a mistress's whispered word. Queens, too, gained more leverage, as dynastic marriages increasingly linked the crowns of Europe, turning queens into representatives of foreign powers. Their position as political actors became more entrenched. Publicly humiliating a queen by flaunting a mistress could strain not just domestic relations, but delicate international alliances. When your wife's brother was also the King of France, or the Holy Roman Emperor, you thought twice before elevating a concubine at her expense. Legal structures also played a role. The push to formalize lines of succession meant that illegitimate children had fewer routes to power, making concubinage less strategically useful. Inheritance disputes had torn apart enough kingdoms to convince rulers that blurring the legitimacy line was dangerous. Marriages were increasingly negotiated to maximize both fertility and political advantage, and mistresses could not play the same dynastic insurance role they once had. You can picture a court in transition. The king still keeps a mistress, but she is housed discreetly, away from the palace. Her presence is acknowledged only in certain circles, and she appears in public rarely, if at all. The lavish displays of earlier centuries, the public seating near the king, the processions, the tournaments where she handed out prizes, are replaced by quieter, more private meetings. The gossip is still there, but the spectacle is gone. In some places, the decline of concubinage was accelerated by scandal. A single mistress's overreach could provoke a backlash strong enough to make the practice politically toxic. If a concubine was seen as meddling in government affairs, bankrupting the treasury with her luxuries, or undermining the queen, nobles could rally around reform as a way to limit the king's perceived excesses. In the age of printed pamphlets, such stories could spread far faster and wider than before. There's a symbolic shift too in the way kings were portrayed. Where medieval imagery often celebrated the king's hunting prowess, knightly vigour and largesse toward ladies, later representations leaned towards solemnity, wisdom and moral leadership. A ruler whose personal life seemed restrained was easier to cast as a just father to his people, a shepherd of both the kingdom's political and spiritual health. You imagine the old guard at court, shaking their heads over these changes. In my father's day, one might mutter over a goblet of wine, a king's mistress could make or break a man's fortunes. Now the younger courtiers might shrug and point out that influence was better won through service in the council chamber than in the royal bedchamber. Even so, the decline was uneven. In some courts, particularly in regions where Renaissance culture embraced a certain romantic libertinism, royal mistresses remained visible into the early modern period. They shifted from being quasi-political partners to cultural icons, patrons of the arts, and arbiters of fashion. Their influence was less about appointments and treaties, more about shaping the court's image and the king's personal brand. But in the strictly medieval sense, as semi-official, politically embedded members of the royal household, standing alongside the queen, concubines became rare by the close of the Middle Ages. The combination of moral reform, legal tightening, and changes in governance had closed off the niches they once occupied. You walk through the imagined Great Hall one last time in this era. The queen sits beside the king, her position undisputed. Courtiers cluster around ministers and secretaries, not around a rival household of a royal mistress. The grand gestures that once proclaimed a concubine's place in the power structure, the jewel-laden procession, the public exchange of gifts, are memories, spoken of nostalgically or bitterly by those who thrived in that older order. Outside the palace walls, the public mood has shifted. Ballads no longer praise the king's many loves. Instead, they praise his devotion to his wife or his role as a defender of the faith. The idea that a concubine could be an accepted part of royal life seems to a new generation almost like a relic, one of those strange customs of our ancestors that people half believe and half romanticize. And yet, the echoes remain. In certain aristocratic households, a nobleman might still keep a favourite in a manner that deliberately recalls the old royal traditions. Plays and poems might revive the image of the beautiful, clever mistress, whose charm sways a king. Artists, looking for dramatic subjects, still paint scenes of medieval courts where queens and concubines shared the same stage, knowing their patrons will enjoy the mixture of history and intrigue. The decline of concubinage didn't erase its memory, it transformed it. What had once been a living, breathing part of court politics became a story, one that could be retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted according to the needs of the moment. In some ways, the end of the practice in reality only strengthened its life in legend. As you step back from the scene, you realize that the absence of concubines in the later court is as telling as their presence once was. The medieval king's household had been a microcosm of his realm, full of competing interests, delicate alliances, and personal relationships woven into governance. With concubines removed from that stage, power flowed through fewer, more formal channels. Politics became less about proximity to king's person and more about position in the machinery of the state. For the women who might once have been royal favourites, this meant finding other paths: marriage into strategic families, service in the households of queens and princesses, or patronage of cultural and charitable works. The game of influence did not end, it simply moved to new arenas. And somewhere, in the quieter rooms of the palace, an old tapestry still hangs, faded but still showing the likeness of a king, seated between his crowned queen and a richly dressed woman without a crown, both looking out at the viewer. The courtiers of a new century pass it without much notice, but those who pause see in it a glimpse of a world that has slipped away, leaving only its stories behind. Even as concubinage faded from the real-life courts of Europe, it refused to vanish from the imagination. In some ways, the women who had once been accepted fixtures beside queens became even more visible, not in council chambers or feasting halls, but in the painted panels, written romances, and whispered tales of the generations that followed. The decline of the practice in reality created a space for myth, and the myths were often more colourful, dramatic, and enduring than the truth. Painters of the late Renaissance and Baroque eras, looking back on the Romantic Middle Ages, reimagined concubines as exotic heroines or dangerous temptresses. They were given shimmering silks, elaborate pearl headdresses, and impossibly luminous skin, idealized figures that owed more to the artist's fantasy than to any actual medieval fashion. These women were often depicted in moments of heightened drama, receiving a love token from the king, glancing with sly triumph toward a seething queen, or gazing out a palace window as if contemplating her influence over the fate of nations. One mainstream historical fact here: in the centuries after Agnes Sorel's death, she appeared in countless works of literature and art, often portrayed as a flawless beauty whose relationship with Charles VII brought him renewed vigour in driving the English from France. Chroniclers from her own time had noted her political role, but later depictions exaggerated her as a figure of pure romance, erasing much of the strategic calculation that had defined her real life. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some 18th century stage plays set in medieval courts, concubines were given exotic backstories, hailing from far-off kingdoms invented by the playwright, complete with made-up languages, simply to heighten the sense of intrigue. Audiences wanted spectacle, and if history had to bend a little to provide it, so be it. The myths about concubines took many forms. In some, they were the king's true love, tragically recognized by a cold and political queen. In others, they were cunning villains who manipulated the king for personal gain, leading the realm into ruin. Both images flattened the complex reality of their lives, but both proved irresistible to storytellers. Popular literature in the early modern period often cast concubines as symbols of unrestrained passion, a direct contrast to the ideal of the virtuous, obedient wife. Moralists used them in cautionary tales, warning that indulgence in such relationships would lead to downfall. Romantics, meanwhile, celebrated them as women who dared to love boldly, defying convention even in the shadow of a crown. You picture a candlelit salon in Paris or London, where aristocrats and writers sip wine while debating whether a certain concubine of history had been a saintly muse or a scheming enchantress. In these conversations, facts mattered less than the emotional pull of the story. The queen's name might barely be mentioned. The concubine was the star. By the 19th century, with the rise of historical novels, concubines were fully entrenched as literary archetypes. Sir Walter Scott's romanticized medieval worlds featured mysterious women who could be seen as echoes of historical favorites. In France, writers like Alexandre Dumas wove courtly intrigue into sprawling narratives, and while not every character was drawn from a real concubine, the trope of the king's beautiful, dangerous lover was by then so established that it needed no introduction. This romanticizing had an interesting side effect. It softened the political edge of concubinage in public memory. Where once these women had been recognized, even respected for their role in negotiating alliances, influencing appointments, and managing the king's moods, they became primarily remembered for their beauty and love affairs. The reality that their positions were often acts of survival in a perilous court was blurred into a haze of silken gowns and moonlit gardens. Yet some artists and historians pushed back against the purely romantic view, emphasizing the human cost of these relationships. Paintings might show a dismissed concubine leaving the palace with her belongings in a cart, her head bowed while the court whispers. Historical essays dug into legal records to show how many of these women, once powerful, died in relative obscurity, or struggled to secure futures for their children after the king's death. The tension between reality and romance created a dual legacy. On one side were the glamorous myths, the mistress as muse, the embodiment of feminine allure. On the other were the grittier, often sadder truths, the mistress as political actor, vulnerable to the same ruthless tides of favour that ruled every part of the court. Both versions persisted, sometimes even in the same telling. You imagine standing in front of a 19th century painting in a museum today. The label explains that the subject is the king's favourite, a work inspired by a 14th century court. In the painting, the woman reclines on a cushioned bench, a letter in her hand, sunlight catching the jewels at her throat. There is no hint of the political tension, the careful strategy, or the precarious balance that defines such a role in reality. She is frozen in beauty, her story reduced to a single moment that never quite happened. In modern historical fiction and film, concubines have enjoyed a resurgence, often as complex protagonists. Audiences now crave more than just the archetype. They want backstory, motivation, and agency. A television series might depict a concubine navigating court politics with as much skill as any minister. Her relationship with the queen, alternating between rivalry and reluctant alliance. The romance is still there, but it is braided with ambition, fear, and a shrewd awareness of the stakes. This shift reflects a broader change in how we view history, where earlier generations preferred neat moral categories. The virtuous queen, the wicked mistress. Modern retellings embrace ambiguity. We can now hold in our minds the idea that a concubine might have loved the king sincerely, benefited from his favour, and also worked relentlessly to protect herself and her children from the brutal politics around her. Still, the myths endure alongside the facts. Travel guides to historic palaces often linger on tales of the king's favourite rooms, or the secret passage to the mistress's quarters, even when historians point out that such features may never have existed. Tourists want the thrill of scandal, the sense that behind the solemn portraits and stone walls, passion once burned brightly enough to alter the course of history. It's also telling that queens rarely receive the same romantic treatment. In legend, they are either wronged and noble, or cold and political, rarely allowed the same mix of passion and cunning granted to concubines in storytelling. This imbalance speaks to the enduring cultural fascination with women who exist on the margins of legitimacy, yet hold the attention of power. As you wander mentally through these shifting portrayals, you notice how each era's concubine reflects its own values and fantasies. The medieval chronicler's favourite might be celebrated for her loyalty and her ability to bear sons. The Renaissance poets might be adored for beauty and wit. The 18th century playwrights might be exoticized and tragic. The modern novelist might be layered, conflicted, and fiercely intelligent. All of these visions are, in a way, true, and all are, in another way, false. They tell us less about the actual women who lived beside medieval queens, and more about the societies that have retold their stories. The myths and romanticized depictions have ensured that, long after the last semi-official concubine faded from a European court, the role still exists in our cultural imagination. She remains the woman in the shadow of the throne, her beauty a weapon, her influence a mystery, her story a blend of history and invention, and perhaps that is her final victory, to be remembered at all, when so many women of her time, even those of high birth, are lost entirely to history's silence. You find yourself once more in the echoing corridors of this imagined medieval palace. But the air is gentler now. The bustle of court intrigues, the whispers of rivalry, the clink of goblets at feasts, all of it seems to fade into a slower, softer hum. This is the final stretch of our long walk, and though the stories of concubines beside queens belong to another age, the echoes of their presence have not entirely gone silent. In today's monarchies, those that still exist, the role of royal consort is publicly bound to strict protocols of marriage, diplomacy, and image. Yet the fascination with the king's other woman lingers in the public mind. Modern tabloids and gossip columns often leap on any rumor of royal scandal, weaving tales that, while lacking the political function of medieval concubinage, still echo its central themes: the tension between public duty and private desire, between official image and intimate truth. One mainstream historical fact here: in the 20th century, the relationship between King Edward VIII of Britain and Wallis Simpson was not a case of concubinage. She became his wife, but the scandal surrounding it revived public memory of royal affairs in earlier centuries. Newspapers and radio dramatized the idea of a woman, outside the accepted royal order, holding sway over a monarch's heart and decisions. And here's your quirky tidbit. In certain European royal households today, staff informally refer to the residences of particularly close friends of the monarch as the other wing, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the old palaces where favourites were given entire suites. It's not meant literally, but the joke shows how the idea of the royal favourite still holds a place in palace humour. You picture a modern royal family attending a state banquet, the king and queen seated side by side, cameras flashing, news outlets dissecting every gesture. The formalities are immaculate, the symbolism carefully curated, yet the very same week, a tabloid might run a speculative headline about the mysterious confidant who dined privately with the king months earlier, stirring that old brew of intrigue and speculation. The court of public opinion, in the age of mass media, has replaced the murmuring Great Hall. Of course, the political landscape has changed beyond recognition. In most constitutional monarchies, kings no longer appoint ministers on a whim, raise armies by personal decree, or grant estates like sweets at a feast. The kind of direct influence a concubine could wield in the Middle Ages, shaping policy through whispered counsel, is almost impossible in the formalized, scrutinized systems of governance today. Yet influence itself has not vanished. It has simply taken subtler forms, and it is far more likely to be exercised through public image, charity work and private networks than through courtly patronage. What lingers most, perhaps, is the cultural archetype. In film, literature, and popular imagination, the royal mistress remains a potent figure, beautiful, clever, often underestimated, and capable of shifting the story's course through intimacy with power. Modern dramatizations of historical courts, from prestige television series to paperback romances, continue to return to the triangle of king, queen, and concubine, using it as a lens through which to explore ambition, love, loyalty, and betrayal. In some ways, the fascination is sharper now than it was for many medieval people. Then, the presence of a concubine might have been an accepted, even expected part of court life, unremarkable unless it caused a political crisis. Now, in an age where monogamy is an ideal tied tightly to public morality, any hint of infidelity in a royal household becomes instant global news, triggering both outrage and fascination. The parallels to the medieval era are not exact, but they are enough to stir the sense that history's patterns never vanish entirely. They just change costumes. Then, a concubine might have influenced the appointment of a commander. Now, a close friend might influence the tone of a charitable foundation's projects. Then, her apartments were tucked near the king's private chambers. Now, the nearby rooms might be proximity in the pages of a monarch's schedule, shared causes, or frequent private meetings. And yet, it is important to remember that the medieval women we've been walking beside in these halls were not simply footnotes to their king's passions. They were navigators in a dangerous, highly stratified world. They balanced personal survival with the ambitions of their families, managed households that could rival those of dukes, and learned to read the ever-shifting weather of court favour with an instinct as sharp as any general's reading of a battlefield. Some, as we've seen, became patrons of the arts, leaving behind chapels, paintings, and cultural trends that shaped their eras. Others raised children who went on to wield significant influence, sometimes even wearing crowns themselves, and many more slipped from the record, their names preserved only in fragmentary mentions, but whose lives were no less filled with the quiet negotiations and daily vigilance that court life demanded. You imagine leaving the Great Hall now, passing back down the long corridor to the palace gates. The Queen's apartments are behind you, the concubines' rooms down another hall, both now empty of their former occupants. Outside, the city hums in medieval times, with the clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the cries of market sellers. In modern times, with the chatter of journalists and the glow of camera flashes, the players change, but the fascination remains. There's a strange comfort in the endurance of these stories. They remind us that history is not only made in battlefields and council chambers, but in private rooms, at banquet tables, in gardens and in glances that pass between people who understand each other's power. Concubines beside queens may no longer walk in the courts of Europe, but their shadows linger in the way we still talk about proximity, power, who has it, how they got it, and what it costs. And maybe that is why their stories have lasted so long. They are not just about kings and the women they loved or desired. They are about influence in its most human form, born from trust, intimacy, and the knowledge of what to say in the right moment. In the medieval world, that could change the fate of a kingdom. In the modern world, it can still shape the narrative around those who sit on thrones. So as our journey through these imagined halls comes to a close, the air grows quieter still. The last light of day glances off the high windows, throwing long shadows across the flagstones. You pause, feeling the weight of all the stories that have passed here, the whispered alliances, the calculated courtesies, the stolen moments of joy or ambition. And then, as the shadows deepen, your steps slow. The noise of court life fades away entirely, replaced by the hush of centuries settling over these stones. You let the final images linger, a queen in her formal crown, a concubine in a gown of deep velvet, a king between them, the threads of politics and affection binding them in ways both fragile and strong. Now the corridors are empty, the feasts long ended, the intrigues folded into the pages of history. The women we followed are gone, but the shape of their lives, the blend of peril, privilege, and presence, still leaves a trace in every story we tell about power. So let your shoulders relax. Let the last torches in this imagined palace burn low. Outside, the air is cool, the city quiet, and the long history of kings, queens, and their companions settles into stillness. The tale is complete, but its echoes remain, ready to rise again whenever someone asks, with a spark of curiosity, why did medieval kings keep concubines beside their queens?